book's title is called Asia's Energy Challenge, and we're really fortunate to have the authors with us today. Dr. Minsoo Lee and Dr. Donghyun Park. Dr. Lee is a senior economist in the Macroeconomics and Finance Research Division of Asian Development Bank. His backgrounds include full professorship at Peking University, HSBC Business School in China. And Dr. Park is currently the principal economist at the Economics and Research Department of the Asian Development Bank as well. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Park and Dr. Lee.
Okay, let's begin the presentation. My name is Donghyun Park, and this is my colleague Minsoo Lee. So we are here at TDRI to present our relatively new book, this one, Asia's Energy Challenge, Key Issues and Policy Options. And first of all, we would like to thank TDRI, which we know is Thailand's premier economic think tank, economic policy making think tank, for giving us the opportunity to make this presentation on this issue, which is not only important for Asia, but also certainly important for Thailand as well. So So this book, right, which is a joint publication between Routledge and the Asian Development Bank, it's a collective volume for background papers that were prepared for the Asian Development Outlook 2013 Special Theme Chapter. This is ADO, or Asian Development Outlook, is an annual flagship report produced by our research department. It's published twice a year. The main report is published in April, and the update is published in October, although this year it came out in late September. So just to give you some, although many of you are probably familiar with Asian Development Outlook, let me just give you a brief background of what ADO is. It consists of three parts. The one part, right, the first part consists of regional economic outlook. In other words, what's our macroeconomic outlook for developing Asia as a whole? What are the short-term growth prospects? What are the short-term risks to that outlook, and so forth? The second part of the ADO consists of country chapters. The main report in April has 45 or so country chapters, which looks at the short-term macro outlook for all our developing member countries, from our giants, the giants of our region, China and India, all the way down to small Pacific microstates such as Nauru and Tonga. So each country has its own country chapter, right? Looks at the China's short-term growth prospects, what are the risks to China's short-term outlook, and so forth. That's part two, country chapters. And the third part looks at it's a special theme chapter. That part, which I usually work on, and which also my colleague Dr. Minsoo Lee also usually works on, is the special theme chapter, and it usually explores an issue, a developmental issue that is relevant to Asia's long-term growth. Some of the issues that we explored the last 5, 6, 7 years include economic impact of Asia's population aging, or Asia services sector development, or immediately after the global crisis broke out, rebalancing Asia's growth more toward domestic demand, right? And so forth. But last year, in 2013, the special theme chapter for ADO 2013 that came out in April was Asia's Energy Challenge, because we felt it was a very good opportune time to look at Asia's challenge. energy challenge. How is Asia going to satisfy the enormous demand, right, in energy, the enormous growth in energy demand that it will face as it continues to grow rapidly in the future. So the book basically, this book is a collected volume of the background papers that were prepared for the special theme chapter. There are about 10 or 11 or 12 background papers that were prepared for the ADO 2013 special theme chapter, and we thought it would be a terrible waste, right, to let these good papers, right, go to waste. So we decided to make a book out of it together with Routledge, right, which is a very reputable publisher. So what this book does is it lays out the key issues in Asia's energy security. In other words, what are some key issues that we face in order to achieve a more secure energy future for the region, and more specifically from a policy-oriented think tank like the TDRI, I think what is especially valuable and relevant is policy options, right? So what are some concrete, specific, actionable policy options that Asia can put into place, that Thailand can put into place to secure ample energy for tomorrow, affordable energy that the poor can afford for tomorrow, and environmentally sustainable or clean energy for tomorrow. So with that brief introduction, let me just very briefly describe the contents of this book before I turn it to my colleague Minsoo. By the way, Minsoo was the overall leader of this study, and I basically played a supporting role. So this book, this collected volume, consists of 4 parts. Part 1, me, myself, Minsoo, and Harry Saunders, an external consultant who helped to put the study together. What we do is we provide an overview. What are the key issues? What are the key challenges? What are some possible solutions? So we provide this big picture overview in part 1. Now, part 2 of this book looks at the issue of energy security, energy sustainability, and energy affordability. So in the first chapter, global oil expert David Isaac looks at an issue which is hugely important to Asia's energy future, and that is that we have a very large and growing appetite for imported oil, and as Minsoo will discuss in more detail, more and more of that oil will be coming from the Middle East. But the bigger point here is that the one unchangeable, the one key constant in Asia's energy future is that we will depend more and more on imported oil. So that's the problem. Of course, David Isaac also suggests some solutions. What are some ways to reduce that dependence? What are some ways to achieve more oil security in Asia's future? Now, continuing with part 2, this chapter by Norberto Fuego, it looks at, it provides some, rather than just saying this and that, it's always nice to have some numbers, right? Some quantitative estimates. And what that chapter does is it provides quantitative estimates of the 3 basic dimensions that I talked about. In other words, adequacy, enough. Are we going to have enough energy in our future? Affordability, are poor Asians and poor Thais going to be able to afford energy? And then thirdly, environmental sustainability. So this chapter, it's a very valuable chapter because it provides some quantitative estimates, right, of these 3 key dimensions: adequacy, affordability, and environmental sustainability. And it also looks at the regional integration of energy systems. For example, the Greater Mekong subregion, GMS subregion, of which Thailand is a part. Of course, there's a great scope, right, for mutually beneficial cooperation within GMS. Now, this another paper in this part 2, it looks at the issue of energy poverty in Asia and what are some options for mitigating energy poverty in Asia by Benjamin Silvercomb. Now, part 3, it turns to the issue of energy and the environment. And if you think about it, basically there are 4 major environmental risks, right, associated with our growing appetite for energy, growing demand for energy. Some of these environmental risks are local, air pollution and water pollution and water availability, but some of it is contributing, each country contributing to a global problem, such as climate change, and very close related to the issue of climate change is, of course, the issue of land use change. And then there's the author forcefully argues that Asian countries, as countries in other parts of the world, must somehow internalize these external costs so that we use energy more efficiently. Now the next chapter by Deepak Sharma, it looks at the potential for energy efficiency improvements, and this is the most of the chapters in this book look at the supply side, but this chapter by Deepak Sharma looks at the demand side, and more specifically, it looks at potential for improving energy efficiency, and the main finding there is that the potential for improvement is quite substantial, and the welfare gains from better use of energy, more efficient use of energy in Asia is quite large. Now the next chapter, now this is part 4. So what are some options on the supply side, and what are some options on regional integration of energy system? This interesting chapter by Michael Ross looks at unconventional gas and also renewable energy sources such as wind power, such as solar power, and the main conclusion is that the potential for these newer energy sources, unconventional gas, shale gas, right, and renewable energy sources, their potential is quite limited if we look just at the short run, but they offer much greater promise in the medium and long term. Now the next chapter by Jung-Ho Hong and his co-authors, that looks at the electricity generation sector, right, the power sector of Asia, and their main finding is there's substantial scope for improving the efficiency of our power sector, our electricity generation systems. And then the next chapter by Rovner and Nam, this looks at the issue of nuclear power, and though we just discussed this before we came here, Dr. Lee and I, that we understand that Thailand, right, is also exploring construction of a nuclear power plant. But of course, in the immediate aftermath of Fukushima, right, in March 2011 in Japan, just as there were in the immediate aftermath of Chernobyl, right, in Ukraine, in this old Soviet Union in the mid-1980s, and before that, right, in 3 Mile Island, right, in Pennsylvania, in the U.S. Of course, there's a completely understandable, but to some extent irrational backlash against nuclear power. For example, Germany acted upon that kind of backlash, and they're phasing out even nuclear power altogether. But the main point of this chapter is, look, let's not get hysterical. Let's look at nuclear power more soberly, more level-headedly, more objectively. Let's look at the benefits. Let's look at the costs. Yes, there are many risks, many costs, safety costs highlighted by the Fukushima disaster, but also other risks for nuclear proliferation, terror risks, and so forth, as well as risks associated with waste disposal. But having said that, nuclear power clearly has some powerful benefits. For example, it's already competitive with other conventional power sources. Unlike solar power, unlike wind power, it's a here and now technology. It's already cost competitive with other conventional energy sources. And also, and this is very important, I think, it also happens to be relatively clean, relatively environmentally friendly kind of an energy source. So it provides this chapter provides a more even-handed, more objective assessment rather than a hysterical post-Fukushima backlash kind of analysis of nuclear power and the prospects for nuclear power in Asia. Now the next chapter by Dr. Lee, myself, and Harry, we looked at the regional cooperation and the integration not only of energy markets but also of energy infrastructure. And the very promising area here in Asia is an area sub-region of which Thailand is a part. That is the Greater Mekong sub-region. That is probably right now the most promising sub-region within all of Asia for a lot of practicable, actionable, mutually beneficial cooperation and integration on the energy front. I mean, for example, Laos, right? Laos TDRI has a lot of surplus power, abundant hydroelectricity. Thailand, on the other hand, is a big net energy importer, so clearly there's scope for mutually beneficial energy integration. Now, most of the chapters in this study look at Asia as a whole, but there are, of course, two countries that are very important, right, because of their sheer size in Asia, and that is China and India. And this chapter by Norberto Fueyo, it looks at how the changing structure of the economy, the changing economic structure of China and India will affect their energy demand, the composition of their energy demand, and so forth over the next 25 years. And then they also suggest some solutions to improve their energy efficiency as well as environmental sustainability of energy use in these two Asian giants, China and India. And finally, what we do is what Minsoo and I and Harry we do is we conclude the book with a summary, nice short summary of what are the main findings that emerge from our book and what are some policy recommendations that we come up with on the basis of those findings. And we ultimately argue we need bold action, we need aggressive action, we need comprehensive action in order to secure a more secure energy future for Asia. So with that, I turn over to the leader of the study, Dr. Minsoo.
Thank you, Donghyun. Thank you very much again for coming to this event. Thank you, TDRI, for hosting this event. It is my big pleasure to speak and review the main findings of this book. Developing Asia's GDP will more than quadruple from 2010 to 2035. And by 2050, the region will produce more than half of global GDP. Cash growth has dramatically improved the developing Asia's living standard, lifting millions out of poverty. Future growth will do the same. By 2050, developing Asia's average standard of living will be equivalent to the current level of Europe's counterpart. The underlying baseline assumption on economic growth for this analysis is following the Asian-centric growth. So the phenomena that I just explained about Asian economic growth, the promising vision of Asia's 21st century is often called Asian-centric growth scenario. By examining the region's economic performance over the couple of decades, this Asian-centric growth scenario is quite achievable. However, crucially, can developing Asia secure the energy it needs to fuel this dramatic economic expansion? The question is not simply identifying where such energy will come from. True energy security for Asia relies on three foundational pillars. One, the adequacy and reliability of physical energy supply. Two, environmental sustainability. Three, affordable access. So this tripartite nature of this energy challenge calls for a strong balancing act to avoid unsatisfactory trade-offs that weaken one or more of the pillars, and so defeat our Asia's energy security quest. In 2010, Asia contributed about 28% of global GDP and accounted about 34% of global primary energy consumption. By 2035, the region's share of the global GDP will be around 44%. If the Asia wants to maintain this economic expansion by 2035, huge energy requirements will be necessary. So if Asia energy intensity trend follows its expected path, then the primary energy consumption share at the global level by 2035 will increase to 51%. However, if Asia's energy intensity follows the historical trend, then the primary energy demand for developing Asia by 2035 will be as high as 56%. So energy needs for the Asian century are critical. While developing Asia's primary energy demand will substantially increase over the next few decades, developing Asia's energy endowments are not sufficient. Asia has abundant coal reserves. It commands about 26% at the global level. And China has about half of Asia's share of the coal reserves. The region's share of the conventional natural gas reserves is only 60%. And Asia's share of technically recoverable oil is merely 9%. And if we combine that with the natural gas liquids, it commands about 15%. Developing Asia's insufficient energy endowment has many implications. As Tom just explained, the most significant implications is developing Asia's oil import will triple by 2035. In 2010, Asia's oil imports account about 33%. No. In 2010, Asia's import nearly half of all crude oil traded in international markets. Control over Asia's oil supply has steadily shifted toward the Middle East suppliers. In 1990, about 33% of developing Asia's oil imports came from the Middle East. And in 2010, the figure has risen to 48%. As this trend likely to continue, Asia's high and increasing dependence on a single region will pose a significant risk for adequate and reliable energy security. Due to Asia's insufficient energy endowment and relatively strong economic growth, only 3 economies in Asia will be energy self-sufficient by 2035. I want to give you 2 examples for this case. For China's case, its energy self-sufficient rate is projected to deteriorate from 95% in 2010 to about 53% by 2035 due to increasing dependence on imported coal and oil to meet the rising primary energy demand. As mentioned, China has relatively abundant coal reserves, and the economy is the world's largest producer and consumer of coal. Most of the coal demand used to be met by the domestic production. However, the rising domestic coal price raised the coal imports substantially from 2009. China's growing oil demand also increasing the reliance on imports. Simple suggestion for China's case to improve the energy self-sufficient rate is exploration of unconventional shale gas and technology development, along with infrastructure investment in new and renewable energy sources, and to improve the energy self-sufficient rate. Since we are in Thailand, let me talk about Thailand's case. For Thailand's case, energy self-sufficient rate is also projected to deteriorate from about 62% in 2010 to about only 20% by 2035 due to increasing energy import dependency, of course. Thailand is highly dependent on oil imports, fossil fuel imports, I would say. It faces difficulty in increasing domestic production of oil and natural gas, which will be depleted over the medium term unless new reserves are discovered. Thailand should encourage developing alternative energy supply, such as transport biofuels, and increasing the share of renewable energy, such as wind, solar, biomass, for power and heat generation as the Renewable and Alternative Energy Development Plan sets out the framework. Furthermore, it is critical for Thailand to reduce dependence on natural gas for electricity generation amid dwindling domestic natural gas production. Nuclear power plants and imports of electricity from China, Laos, and Myanmar could be a possible solution. To summarize, for Thailand case, limited domestic oil and gas resources will make it necessary for Thailand to diversify energy supply sources through utilization of new and renewable energy to improve energy security. At the same time, practical measures need to be in place to help deploy new and renewable energy sources. Now, Asia's insufficient energy endowment is not the only concern. The composition of its energy mix needs to be discussed and considered seriously. Without the radical change to its current energy mix, the consumption of fossil fuels will climb, doubling the oil consumption and tripling the natural gas consumption. Even highly polluting coal consumption will rise by a whopping 81% by 2035. This picture shows the energy mix in developing Asia overall. So let me give you some numbers in terms of share of each energy mix, coal will account for 44% by 2035, and oil 23%, natural gas 16%, new and renewable 10.3%, nuclear 4.1%, and hydro 2.2%. What about Southeast Asia's case? The picture is pretty much similar to overall developing Asia's case. Again, let me give you some numbers. Coal will increase from 15.5% in 2010 to 24.1% by 2035 for Southeast Asia case. Oil slightly decrease from 35% to 34%. Natural gas slightly about the same, 22.5% to 22.2%. Nuclear substantially increased from 0.4% to 1.9%. Hydro will increase from 0.8% to 1.7%. New and renewable decrease from 26% to 16.5%. Now let me be more specific for Thailand case. Primary energy demand in Thailand will increase in terms of the absolute amount from 117.4 million tons of oil equivalent to 208 million tons of oil equivalent, which can be translated to about 2.3% annual growth over the same period. The GDP forecast in our study for Thailand case over the same period is about 4.6%. The primary energy demand, the coal share, will decrease from 13.9% in 2010 to 12.7% by 2035. Oil slightly increased 38% to 39.3%. Natural gas slightly increased from 28% to 29.6%. Nuclear increased from nil to 1.6%. Hydro slight increase from 0.4% to 0.6%. New and renewable decreased from 19.1% to 16.3%. For Thailand case, more interesting point that we might look at is the power generation output share, because there is a uniqueness in Thailand for power generation output. Of course, the natural gas share in the power generation output in 2010, it was close to 75%, which will decrease to 66.4% by 2035. The coal share will slightly increase from 18.8% to 20.9%. And oil decreased from 0.7% to 0.2%. Nuclear, another interesting element that we might look at for Thailand case, increased from nil to 3.6% for the power sector. Hydro, about the same, 3.5% to 4%. New and renewable, right, news for this case increased from 2.1% to 4.9%. So most of you know better than us. Say coal dependence in Thailand in the primary energy demand is relatively lower, but the oil dependence is higher than other countries in Southeast Asia. However, the power generation output is quite different story. The natural gas share is relatively substantially higher, but the oil share is very, very minimal compared to other countries. I understand the generating more power for Thailand case in the near future to meet the increasing demand is kind of a crossroad from the policymaker side, which share they might increase. Is it coal or nuclear power, or maintain the same level with the natural gas? I think this is kind of very complicated and difficult decision the policymakers have to decide. From my humble opinion, I think it is not such a good idea to increase the coal share, because, which I will talk about, the shale gas production in North America will be a game changer. And the share of the natural gas for the power output production in Thailand is already high. So if you give up the natural gas share and substitute with the coal, assuming that clean coal technology is not infant stage, so that we still have to produce a huge amount of pollution for the power generation with the coal firing, I don't think it's a good idea for the environmental sustainability issue. So this is kind of interesting topic for Thailand to discuss. Now the nuclear power, the environmental issue is again very sensitive to Thailand, because Thailand, unlike other countries in Southeast Asia, they do care about the environmental issue, as far as I understand. So nuclear power could be a good alternative, but it's kind of a tricky and sensitive issue again to promote the nuclear power plant for the electricity generation. But what we did in this nuclear power, what we did for this the environmental sustainability issue, what if without the radical change of the current energy mix in developing Asia, how much carbon dioxide emission that we might produce by 2035? From our calculation, we produce about 24 billion tons of CO2 emission by 2035, which exceeds the maximum limit of 22 billion tons by 2035 under IEA 450 scenario assumption. So if we don't do anything to reduce CO2 emission without the radical change in the current energy mix, then theoretically, developing Asia alone will produce more than suggested the global limit of the CO2 emission by 2035. The developing Asia has the unfortunate distinction of having most of the world's energy poor. Energy poverty perpetuates hunger by forcing women and the children to spend hours gathering fuel that they could spend earning income or studying. Unfortunately, about half of total population in the world without access to electricity live in developing Asia, and about 79%, let me give you some absolute number for that, about 2.8 billion population in the world, no, about 2.8 billion Asians have still depend on traditional fuels. So 79% of the total population in the world dependent on traditional fuels live in developing Asia. Energy is a basic human need. So affordable access to energy is a key to an inclusive growth. So policymakers should consider this issue seriously because energy is not a luxurious commodity. It's a basic human need, especially nowadays facing in the near future with modern technology. So when we discuss about inclusive growth, without mentioning the poor people's access and affordable to the energy is kind of nonsense to those poor people. There are many ways to curb the demand in developing Asia. One way to address this energy challenge on the demand side is to replace the inefficient general fuel subsidies by targeted fuel subsidies such as direct cash benefits or energy coupons or other measures that the policymakers could think about directly target the poor people. Fuel subsidies are designed to guarantee affordability and the poorest household from potentially large shocks of the fuel energy increase. There are many simulation results what would be the impact from increase in the fuel price to the poor people. Let me give you one example. One simulation result from Del Granado et al. In their 2012 study show if the fuel price increased by 25 US cents per gallon, then the poor people's real income will be reduced by about 4.5%, which means I think it's a huge reduction in the real income in terms of percentage. However, the general fuel subsidy may lead to an overconsumption and distort, more importantly, nation's energy development planning. Insufficient energy fuel subsidies must be reduced or removed to reduce the fiscal burden. About 4% of GDP in Bangladesh and Pakistan, more than 2% of GDP in India, Indonesia, and Vietnam, a little less than 1% of GDP in the Philippines, spent for general fossil fuel subsidies in 2011. 4% of GDP is quite a lot. So what we can do, or policymakers can do, they can reduce the fiscal burden from 4% to 2% or even 1%, and they can allocate those proceeds to develop a cleaner technology, use of the energy, or infrastructure investment that would make a huge difference. Worse, the main beneficiaries of general fuel subsidies are not the poor people. In many cases, middle-income people, or quite often, high-income people are the major beneficiaries of the general fuel subsidies. When looking at the figures in the slide, only 5 to 15% of the general fuel subsidy went to the poor 20 percentile in developing Asia. I think many countries in developing Asia, including Indonesia, Malaysia, India, policymakers in those economies are considering seriously to reduce the general fuel subsidy nowadays. I think it is a good time to implement quite large amount of reduction in general fuel subsidy. I think Thailand has also fuel subsidy as well, because the oil price started plummeting from the mid this year from $100 to $85. And I think some analysts put their numbers for the next year. Next year, the crude oil price will decrease to around $75 per barrel. So when the oil price is decreasing, it's the right time to implement those elimination of the fuel subsidy to face less resistance from the opposition side. The market energy price hardly reflects the true price of energy when such externality, negative externalities such as the air pollution are factored in. This means the introducing carbon tax could cover such externalities to prevent from overconsumption and to develop the new clean technologies. However, it faces two difficult problems. The first problem is free rider problem, and the second problem, it may undercut affordability, and it may slow economic activity by imposing a carbon tax. There are a couple of ways to address these problems. We introduce two typical ways. In order to solve the free rider problem, we encourage to promote a policy coordination at regional and international level. And the second way to resolve this problem is to implement revenue recycling policy. The European Commission has evaluated this policy, and the UK introduced a climate change levy. They compensated corporate payers of the carbon tax by reducing their contribution to employees' social insurance. So it's sort of win-win situation from the policymaker side and the corporate side. This carbon taxation with revenue recycling can offer a powerful tool for the policymakers. Now take a look at the supply side. Supply security, of course, depends on tapping new energy sources and technology. Expanding its energy supply in a way that is environmentally sustainable will require Asia to more aggressively pursue a combination of renewable and cleaner non-renewable sources and technology to make carbon-based fuels cleaner fuels. These possibilities well described in the book, so I recommend you take a look at the book if you're interested in this topic. The installed capacity in developing Asia has grown from negligible to about 82 gigawatts for wind case, about 36% of the global total, and 20 gigawatts for the solar, which is about 29% of the global total in 2011. Asia has gained headway in boosting generating capacity for solar and wind, and there is a great potential for further expansion. Moreover, Asian companies, particularly the Chinese companies, among the world leaders in manufacturing solar power equipment. The interesting thing is, I'm not talking about connecting the power generation from wind and solar to the base load way, but wind and solar already cost competitive in some remote Asian communities if you don't have to connect the power to the main line. The Asia, hydropower in Asia has been well established, but only 20% of resources have been developed, excluding Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Laos. Tapping the region's hydro potential requires addressing three major concerns. The first one is the community displacement, the second is the loss of the agricultural land, and the third is the environmental cost. Biofuels producing Asia is not major producer, but new technologies that do not compete with food could bolster the role of the biofuels in lowering CO2 emissions from Asia's transport sector. As far as I understand, Thailand policymakers put much emphasis on developing and exploring more biofuels to reduce the CO2 emission in the transport sector. Solar and power. Renewable energy sources such as solar and power are not cost competitive yet. However, if you look at those two panels, the left panel indicates the levelized cost of generating electricity by wind power, the right panel by solar, photovoltaic of course. The left panel, three top bars, the red bars, indicate chronologically reducing cost, levelized cost for Chinese case by wind power. 2011, the maximum cost is about little more than 10 cents. The minimum is about 7 cents or 6 cents. But if you look at the top one, by 2030, the minimum can be quite cost competitive when we compare with gas and coal. So if there is a critical technology improvement to hit the bottom range in 10, 20 years, then the renewable energy sources will be quite cost competitive. And similar story goes for the solar photovoltaic case as well, the right panel. The shale gas I briefly mentioned is a top fare nowadays. The recent experiences in North America shows that the unconventional gas has the potential to significantly change the energy supply picture. The shale gas revolution has been a game changer. China has the largest technically recoverable shale gas reserve. In terms of the absolute amount, it's about 33 gigatons of oil equivalent. In India and Pakistan, in developing Asia, rank top 20. US, the second rank. I just realized, we all know in the United States, they already started producing the shale gas, and maybe they start exporting the shale gas, but they started exporting the natural gas since last year or 2 years ago, and soon many analysts project US will be a net energy exporter in the near future. Now China has a kind of different situation than US. China's case, most of the shale gas reserves allocated in densely populated location, so it is more difficult for Chinese policymakers to start developing shale gas exploration by fracking because they have to reallocate the residents to other places. And the other unique case for the Chinese case is the depth of the shale gas reserve is a lot deeper than the US case. So it will cost more for them to dig deeper to fracking the shale gas. When Dr. Park and I presented this content in China, we learned two things. They have a more positive perspective about these two difficulties. About the densely located shale gas reserve, they say it's a good news. Why? Because the transportation cost will be less. If they start selling the shale gas nearby resident. And about the depth of the shale gas reserve, it's not going to be costing more. It will be costing less. Why? Because if we go deeper and deeper, the pressure will be stronger and stronger. So they need less water to fracking to take the shale gas out of the hole. So they have a different views. And believe it or not, Chinese, with the Chinese technology, China already started producing shale gas. So this will be a real game changer for Asia because, as I said, the crude oil imports dependence in Asia has steadily shifted the Middle East, but 10, 20 years later, the major exporters of energy will be shifting from east to the west. If you consider Middle East is east. So unless China start exploring shale gas in the near future with a sizable commercial price, then the major exporters of energy will be in the west. We are in the east. So how we deal with, as Asian policymakers, how we deal with that different situation, transferring the energy exporter from the east to the west. This will be another sensitive issue for us. However, if the Chinese started exploring and exporting the shale gas to developing Asian region, then the story will be quite different. We can be major exporter along with the west side. So it will be kind of balancing situation. So let's see how the development of the shale gas exploration in China will be moving forward. Needless to say, this unconventional shale gas could provide a cleaner bridge to a future that is less dependent on the fossil fuels. That is for sure. Other than the shale gas, many of us sort of ignore there is another unconventional gas, which is called a methane gas. Indonesia's coal bed methane resources appear to be large, exceeding those of China. But Indonesia has seen a little development because of the policy restrictions. Related to this unconventional gas development, a couple of important issues that we might think about. The first one is the uncertainty about the methane gas leakage when we actually start exploring. The second issue is the water contamination. I don't know how the U.S. will deal with this water contamination as they enlarge the exploration of the shale gas amount. there are many uncertainties in this area. Now, the nuclear power is kind of interesting and sensitive issue to Thailand in particular. So what we did with this nuclear power chapter is when Fukushima incident happened, Germany and Japan, they sort of declared shut down all the currently operating nuclear power plant. So what if at the global level, every single country with nuclear power plant started phasing out, then what happened to CO2 emission? Say, the current one will be phasing out, some will be phasing out in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, but we don't allow a new power plant, nuclear power plant. Then obviously we have to replace the electricity production reduced by the nuclear power with something else. So we use the current mix of the share to produce energy and continue their share all the way to 2035, and the simulation results show about 8% to 13% only in the power sector increase of the CO2 emission. So if we maintain the current ones and allow a new power plant in the near future, then the CO2 emission reduction level obviously bigger than 8 to 13% by 2035. There are many interesting materials in this chapter. Wagner is really a nuclear power expert who wrote this paper with 40 years of experience in IEA, IAEA, and UN, and so on. So very interesting. Take a look at it. And the regional cooperation and integration is again critical issue for developing Asia, including Thailand. The affordable access will arise from the multiplication of gains by integrating regional energy markets. Connecting electricity grids and gas pipelines can create economies of scale that improve efficiency. For example, as Dr. Park mentioned, the GMS Great Mekong subregions case, the integrating power transmission in the GMS will save $14 billion over 20 years. And then by substituting hydropower for fossil fuels, in terms of the CO2 emission reduction, about 14 million tons per year by 2020. But such requires a strong political commitment for cooperation and building necessary infrastructure. As I mentioned, one of the solutions for Thailand to meet the increasing power demand, import from China, Laos, and Myanmar. Of course, the infrastructure is kind of important issue to have the same grid connection. So infrastructure is the issue that we might consider. So let me, this is my last slide, the policy recommendation. What we do at the end of this book, we recommend developing Asian policymakers to create a pan-Asian energy market by 2030. So in order for the policymakers to initiate this, at least a ministerial task force could be established to study the European experience and promote the political will to share information and harmonize regulation, standards, and the pricing policies. Some say, oh, this can be merely a pipeline dream, which could be almost impossible by 2030. But if you look at the bilateral and the regional cooperation that already exists in developing Asia, many people, many experts in regional cooperation and integration area is not a pipeline dream. It could be achieved even before 2030 as long as the policymakers in the related country take this issue seriously. Research and development is also crucial to modernizing the region's energy sector. Resistance of the existing energy source can be supported by the research and the development. There is no single bullet to kill all disease on every what counts. So diversification of the sources of energy and the demand side to curb the increasing energy to demanding the energy demand by improving the energy efficiency, which Thailand government puts emphasis on. I think according to the plan, 25% reduction in energy demand over the next 20 years or so. So Asia must keep in mind that every potential source has merits and shortcomings, but above all, every one counts. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee and Dr. Park. The floor is now open for questions or any comments on the book. We actually have the book here, and I understand that you would like to have a copy. You can contact Dr. Lee and Dr. Park. Question?
Hi, this is Chachawan from Siam Siemens. I would like to ask what kind of timeline do you see China really develop their shale gas resources, probably in the same scale as in the US? Because I think they have a very aggressive target. If I remember correctly, it's I think 60 billion cubic meter per year in 2020. You see, it's possible at all?
I don't think that is quite possible. Actually, as I read some sources from China, they sort of scale down the actual exploration steps. Probably as they start developing, exploring shale gas, they might face unexpected difficulties. But the good news is, as I said, they've already started exploring and producing shale gas. The difference between the Chinese case and US case, is my personal view, is US takes more steps toward to explore the shale gas than China might do. So once Chinese technology start kicking in, probably the speed of the exploring and increasing the production of the shale gas output will be a lot faster than US. That's my humble view.
If I may add one more thing to this question. Also the speed with which China can increase its shale gas output or shale gas production will depend a lot on the improvement of technology, shale gas extraction technology, and that in turn will depend on the willingness and ability, well, in particular the willingness of the U.S., which is of course the world leader in shale gas production, to share its advanced technology with the Chinese. And I'm quite hopeful because this is an example of a mutually beneficial, and there's no threat to the U.S. from China increasing its own energy self-sufficiency. So I'm quite optimistic that the U.S. will openly share its technology, and that it would be a good example of energy cooperation between the U.S. and China.
I think I have one more question. So on coal, how do you see the future in coal? Because I think they have newly developed like carbon capture technology for coal power plant. Do you see that catching on? Because now I think Beijing is trying to reduce their coal share of power mix. Right now it's 70%. They want to make it like 65%.
That technology is still widely used. I think it's still initial stage carbon capture storage technology. So and the cost-wise, it'll take a huge amount of capturing carbon, and the other problem is where do you capture? So in order to capture that, you also have to spend some money. So it is still infant stage at this point in time. But clean coal technology might be more practical, and it can be realized sooner than widely used CCS technology. So I understand some countries already started using clean coal technology to reduce the CO2 emission. So I don't know how practical and how much coal they can reduce. I don't see any numbers between the coal and the clean coal technology difference.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first question is, I'd like to know when you project the energy mix of different countries, what are your assumptions about the price of the each of the energy, especially when you're expecting shale gas? I would like to know what is the impact of shale gas on the prices of different types of energy, and whether that's taken into consideration when you do the projection. My second question is about the pipeline dream that you mentioned. I follow a little bit the ASEAN grid, which is part of the AEC. And it's very obvious that ASEAN grid is rather stalled. It hasn't gone anywhere. And one of the criticism of the ASEAN grid is that two points. One point is that because it's unlike EU where there's two-way trade between different countries exchanging different electricity pools. Whereas in ASEAN is one way, Thailand sucking in all our neighbors' resources. So it's not a balanced trade, it's just one way. We buy gas from Myanmar, so there's a one-way pipeline running from Myanmar to Thailand. So whether that, given that kind of pattern of trade, would a pipeline network be feasible or grid be feasible? That's my question.
I'll answer the first one. When we made a projections on this energy mix, we considered two different cases. One is business as usual. The other is the alternative case. Business as usual is we just assume the current and the future policy and design will be implemented as usual. And the shale gas exploration factored in, but with a mild assumption. We don't expect a huge amount of shale gas will be available in the near future. In alternative case, on the other hand, we have more aggressive attitude toward shale gas exploration and the price of the crude oil price and the economic growth assumption, population growth assumption, and so on. And plus the current policy that mentioned by the policymakers in many countries will be 100% implemented and it will be factored in our alternative case. Comparing those two different projections, the difference is not really high, believe it or not. The obvious difference that we see from those two projections is on the new and the renewable share. The coal share pretty much the same, the oil share pretty much the same, because those two are dominating the energy mix in developing Asia. I haven't looked at a single country case, the Thailand case, but probably as I said, new and renewable share will be quite different story between the two. Then what would be the substitute if the renewable is increasing with alternative case? Then we see a reduction in all those other mix. For example, the coal share reduction, a little bit of reduction in the coal share, and the oil share will be also reduced and so on. So the crude oil price is kind of surprised. When we made a projection back in 2012, we didn't see the crude oil price will be $85 by the end of 2014 and $75 in 2015. Well, we are not God, so we just make a reasonable price assumption when we make a projection. So if we forecast based on this different crude oil price, then highly likely the oil share will be increased, I guess. The second question.
Yeah, but before I turn to the second question, let me just briefly also expand on your first question, which, as I understand, is basically what is the impact, right, of the shale gas revolution, relative energy prices, and therefore the impact on the energy mix, right, mix of energy. I mean, Dr. Lee already gave a good explanation, but if I may expand a little further, I think our assumptions, right, the assumptions underlying our energy mix projections somewhat underestimates the impact of the shale gas revolution, and it's turning out to be much more powerful than we expected. The current, I mean, Dr. Lee talked about the current softness, right, of oil prices, which has declined much sharper than we expected, and that is for sure partly does reflect the weakness of the weaker than expected state of the world economy. But I think more fundamentally there are medium to long-term supply forces at work, primarily triggered by the shale gas revolution. So the point is this: even if the U.S. does not export 1 cubic meter, right, of shale gas to Asia and become self-sufficient, that will have huge impact on Asia because it moderates global oil prices, and that just physically, in terms of supply and demand, that that will help to reduce global oil prices. But on top of that, I think Asian countries, right now Asia is heavily dependent on Middle East oil, but I think that equation might be turned around a bit. And Middle East oil exporters, right, will become ever more dependent on Asian importers, so we might be able to get better price for Middle Eastern oil, which we explained Asia is becoming increasingly dependent upon. So I think the assumptions underlying our projections significantly underestimate the impact of the shale gas revolution on relative energy prices and therefore relative energy mix that we will see going forward in Asia. So in response to your second question, I don't think that Myanmar only exporting and Thailand only importing, or Lao PDR only exporting and Thailand only importing, I don't think that has any negative impact on the prospects for energy cooperation and integration in Asia, because I think that's absolutely fine. That's comparative advantage. There's some countries with more energy that they can use, and some countries with a net demand for energy. So it's a mutually beneficial exchange. That's just the basis for a market-based, right, mutually beneficial energy integration. But even in that, but beyond that, even if that is the case, even if at the level of primary energy sources, right, whether it's hydroelectric power or something else, Laos has surplus, Thailand has excess demand. There's a mutually beneficial exchange there. But even beyond that, if you, for things like electricity grids, right, and if ASEAN is connected through an electricity grid, let's say, then whenever Myanmar, let's say, has some shock or disruption to its electricity supply, then of course, if the systems are harmonized, then it can import from Thailand, right? Even though it would be a net energy export. And I think when Minsoo talked about, Dr. Lee talked about this being like an unrealistic pipe dream, but to some extent, you might argue, but if you look at it from a different perspective, if we proceed country by country, bilateral level, and then at a sub-regional level, then I think we can certainly start building toward a pan-Asian market, whether that's 2030, 2035, or 2040. I don't think that's that important, but I think at least we can begin, right, at the bilateral level, and at the sub-regional level, such as GMS, we can start building toward a common pan-Asian energy market, which will benefit all of us.
Just following whether to build a grid to procure energy resource, it also depends on the potential future energy, let's say Thailand, where it would get its potential energy source. Will it be LNG? For example, PTT, our national oil company, is building a huge terminal for LNG, huge capacity. So in a way, it's significant, showing that it expects to import a lot of LNG rather than sourcing from our neighboring countries.
Yeah, I mean that we fully agree with. But having said that, I think there are certain positive externalities from having a common electricity grid. Even though, and if you take a longer horizon, of course, immediately LNG may play a somewhat bigger role than it is now. And that kind of investment, which I'm sure the Thailand energy policy experts who have a much better knowledge of the relative costs of the different energy sources, what is the optimal, right, energy mix for Thailand, that's perfectly fine. But if you take a longer time horizon, I think an energy grid, and more generally energy integration at the GMS level, because there are some clear synergies and complementarities that we can talk about. Myanmar, Laos, these countries have a whole lot of hydroelectricity, for example, potential, and that can, ultimately, over a longer term time horizon, benefit Thailand. And I think these kinds of mutually I think it provides longer-term energy security more than anything else. Just as Europe, right? Just as in Europe, these countries, of course, there are supply disruptions due to geopolitical conflict with Russia and Ukraine and so forth, because they're heavily dependent on Russia. But even so, even with these kinds of common external disruptions, the mere fact that they do have a common energy grid and then a pan-European energy market that is functioning well, that clearly delivers substantial benefits over a longer-term horizon. I think regardless of these kinds of short-run shocks or short-run, let's say, preference for LNG or some other energy sources that do not directly depend on this pan-GMS energy grid, I think there are significant benefits to be had. So I think in the end, of course, something like energy investment, infrastructure investment, especially renewable energy, because especially renewable energy, I should clarify, because it's not cost competitive yet, right? So it's not cost competitive yet. What that means is these kinds of energy investments, they, especially relating to renewable energy sources, cannot be left to market alone. The government has to step in, R&D, the necessary infrastructure. So there's clearly a powerful argument for far-sighted as well as efficient, rational, and long-term thinking government policy, energy policy.
I would like to follow up the Dr. Nguyen's question. You have emphasized the benefit of regional integration, including the GMS integrated power transmission. I'm not sure if you have overestimate the potential of the using hydropower to substitute for fuel fossil. Because I think in Thailand, for example, we try to use hydropower before, and it become increasingly it become more and more difficult, and I think even in Laos they will experience the same thing, because it sounds like there are a lot of water, a lot of physical energy, but building a big dam can incur a lot of socio-economic impact, and also political pressure will come. I think once at present the Laotian people do not have much to say against the government when the government try to do this thing, but I think they will more and more vocal, and I think Laos might be able to expand their hydropower, but maybe not as much as one would think, just looking at the physical part of it.
No, I fully agree with you that there are these very sizable, very substantial concerns, right, that have to be dealt with hydropower. But my point was not so much about the benefits of hydropower. I just mentioned that as an example because I'm aware Myanmar and Laos have lots of hydropower potential, and that could potentially benefit Thailand's excess demand for energy. So that it was not an argument for hydroelectric power as such. It was more generally, what we are trying to say is there are clear benefits to be had from a bigger energy market, from a common energy market that links together these 5 countries in China's Yunnan province, because there are a lot of synergies, a lot of complementarities. It also makes for, as I said from my earlier example, if Myanmar's or if Thailand or if any of the GMS countries suffers a temporary shock, let's say a supply shock, because let's say the LNG terminal, the big one you're building is disrupted somehow. I don't want to say terrorist attack, but let's say it's disrupted somehow. Then of course, if you have these kinds of more secure and stable energy system, because your country's grid's connected to the other 5 members of the GMS, that delivers clear benefits, not just for Thailand, but also for the 4 other countries, as well as China's Yunnan province.
Let me just add a couple of remarks. On the previous question, the LNG storage storage expansion in Thailand, it takes quite a long time to change the energy mix. So understanding the natural gas share for the power generation in Thailand is quite high, and understanding the natural resources of LNG in Thailand is dwindling. So the lack of the natural resource, natural production of LNG in the near future will have to need from the import. Probably that's the target from, I don't want to, I'm not trying to defend the policymakers' point of view, but probably the time frame for them to change the energy mix might cause the huge development of LNG storage space. And like hydropower in Myanmar, they already understand the hydropower cannot be only source of the electricity generation for their country alone and for exports to other countries, including Thailand. That's why the Myanmar government already started initiating to have a nuclear power plant and other sources of producing electricity in the future. So we might overestimate the benefit from the regional cooperation, including Myanmar, Laos for the GMS part, but we are not off too much understanding those countries trying to export as much as possible so that they can guarantee the revenue inflow from the energy export, electricity export from the nearby countries. At the same time, in order for them to maintain the revenue inflow from electricity power exports, they have to diversify their own energy supply with other sources of power.
May I ask both of you, if you were policymakers here in Thailand and you have the authority, what will you do and what you won't do in reform the Thai energy sector? If you have the decisive power.
I wish I had. I mentioned a little bit about that when I was talking about the energy self-sufficient rate and the energy mix. The most difficult decision the Thailand policymakers are facing at this point is what to do with the power generation to meet the increasing demand. Should we go coal? Should we go other way of increasing the electricity generation? I don't want to go with coal because, as I said, shale gas will be a game changer. It's easy for Thailand to replace the natural gas power plant by the shale gas. Two, I understand Thailand policymakers and Thailand citizens, they do care about the environment seriously compared to other countries, as I said. So if policymakers go with coal firing power plants, it will face a strong resistance, another political unrest that Thailand wants the gonna last. And three, there are other alternatives instead of, say, waiting for the shale gas exploration. The other alternative is to net the nuclear power plant. Well, we saw the consequences from Fukushima incident, but it could be a man-made disaster. It's not a failure of the technology, as far as I understand. So it could be safely built and maintained well in order to, say, avoid, say, unsatisfactory consequences from the man-made mistake. So it is quite possible. And the other is new and renewable energy sources also possible. I think the policymakers emphasis strong focus on new and renewable. As I said, transport biofuel is very important because the heavy traffic in Thailand can be solved by substituting transport biofuel development. Solar and wind can be connected with a huge investment in technology in the future. So why say you have old-fashioned way that you don't need much technology and development to solve the problem. The other way is, well, it is a little tough, but kind of challenge. You need huge investment, research and development, kind of brighter future, because as far as I understand, if you look at the most countries with a nuclear power plant, their economic development will be a lot faster than other countries without nuclear power plant. Why? Because many of us think about when it comes to nuclear power plant, it connects directly to the electricity generation. There are a lot of applications from the nuclear power generation. Say you go to hospital, you need to take an X-ray. That's the application of the nuclear power. Without nuclear power, you don't need, you cannot take X-ray. When factories produce, say, snacks or some kind of food, they have a choice between they put the preserves, which will harm our health, or they just use the radiation, very small amount of radiation, which is less harmful for the human being. What is the technology? It's coming from the nuclear power plant. So Korea has a heavily depending on nuclear power for the electricity generation. About close to 40% of the electricity generated by the nuclear power. Nowadays, we have many problems. It's mainly man-made, human error problems. We never had a technology problem at all. So I think if I have a decisive power to decide, obviously, plan B. Forget about the coal. It's old-fashioned. It's what is done is done. Forget about the coal. Move forward with the bright future. I think that's the way we should.
I have one concrete suggestion. If I were like making a recommendation to your prime minister or whoever is the senior most policymaker in energy, and it is simply this. I think let's just relate this to what's happening to global oil prices right now. Global oil prices have declined, right? Have fallen much further than expected, and many energy economists, many energy specialists believe that this will last for some time, right? For let's say 5 years, 6 years. But even so, I think this energy planning, energy mix planning, this has to be a long-term, right? Long-term. It has to have a long-term horizon. So I think what I would suggest, what I would ask the policymakers, I mean, if I had that kind of privilege or opportunities to refrain from taking a very short-term view of the oil prices are falling down, so let's go all out for oil powered power plants, electricity plants. That is not the way to go. Yes, there are these short-term ups and downs, but let's look at the long term. So let's invest first of all in regulatory capacity, and then let's explore at least the nuclear power option, and let's also invest the renewable energy options, which look in the short term right now less attractive, right, because of soft oil prices. But let's take a longer term view. I think that's the one thing I would strongly recommend to policymakers.
I would like to hear more about your energy self-sufficiency index, like your projection that increases from around 60 to 70. What is the basis? Perhaps you can explain what is the basis of construction of the index and any implications for the support of the renewable energy?
If you look at the chapter, it will have some equations to calculate the index. I don't want to go into the detail about the technicality of the index. But the basic idea is this: if the energy self-sufficient rate is 100%, then you have 100% indigenous source of energy to meet the demand. If it's zero, then you totally 100% import from other countries. So if you start building nuclear power plant, then you are less dependent on imports. So energy self-sufficient rate might increase. Say if you start developing new and renewable energy sources, those will improve the energy self-sufficient rate. So it directly connects to the research and development, especially new and renewable energy sources. So yes.
So your projection that this index will decline in the future, does it mean that we have less hope on this development?
No, because what we are based on is, let's say, at the time of projection, we have the available information from the policymakers in Thailand. What are their plans? 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, if they are available, we grab the information and we incorporate all those information, and we look at the domestic reserves of the natural resources. For example, for Thailand case, natural gas reserve will be running out soon. So when is the time that they completely run out? So we factor it in. So if they run out, and if they have less and less LNG, then they have to import, as she just mentioned, they start building a huge the storage for the LNG. Yes, that will deteriorate this energy self-sufficient.
If I just may add one more thing. The fundamental intuition the fundamental reason Thailand's self-sufficiency will decline and declines significantly over the next 20, 30 years is simply this. Thailand is a relatively fast-growing economy, right? I think Dr. Lee said something like our assumption is 4.5% a year, which is a very highly reasonable, plausible assumption. What that means is its energy demand, right, will continue to grow rapidly. Yet its supply, right, supply of energy sources will be more or less flat, if not downright decline. So of course, self-sufficiency, simply from high demand growth rate and low or negative supply growth rate. So quite the obvious logical outcome is that self-sufficiency will fall, and Thailand will have to import more on imports, as will do most other Asian countries. Right?
To to be sure what is the numbers of GDP growth and primary energy demand growth at annual base, 4.6% is the GDP growth and 2.3% of the primary energy demand. So starting from 117.4 million tons of oil equivalent in 2010 to 208 million tons of oil equivalent by 2025.
And the reason that primary energy demand grows slower than GDP growth is there are energy efficiency improvements over time, and we do have a range of different assumptions about energy efficiency improvements over time.
Is it true that the power price in Thailand is more expensive than many or most other countries in the region? And how this affect our economic competitiveness?
Korea has the lowest electricity price in East Asia at least. Whenever policymakers or congressmen started mentioning how the electricity price, the president wouldn't be happy about it because it is a sensitive issue, which means it gives a tremendous price competitiveness in Korea to those manufacturers produce outputs for export. So it's kind of a scary issue in Korea to touch or start raising the electricity price. I think that explains pretty much everything for the Thailand case. If the Thailand electricity price is higher than other countries, the price competitiveness will be lower. And policymakers want to do something about it. Depends on how the electricity distribution is organized in the country. Say in Korea's case, there is a KEPCO, Korea Energy wholesale government subsidiary. What they do is they buy all those electricity from all different kinds of producers, nuclear, hydro, gas, oil, coal. The unit price from each producer are different, but they collect all electricity, sell this at exactly the same price to the consumers. So the coal electricity price from the coal is the lowest. Electricity production price from oil will be the highest. Then they compensate each other so that they sort of offset the price difference by way. But I don't know how Thailand government is implementing or exercising distribution of the electricity at the national level. So if you look at the national level distribution, probably you have some way to get some room to reduce the price of the electricity.
Just a couple of points on that. First of all, within ASEAN, for sure, Thailand does not have the highest electricity price. That dubious distinction belongs to Philippines, actually, where we are based. And I think it's very important to know why energy prices, electricity prices are high or low. In the case of Philippines, the answer is quite clear. It's regulatory failure that has resulted in large monopoly power or market power for the utility company, the main utility company there is called Meralco. And of course, there's no social gains whatsoever from that, so that kind of regulatory failure has to be addressed. Secondly, of course, lower electricity prices does give a competitive advantage to your companies, especially energy-intensive manufacturers. But having said that, ultimately, that's not free. That has to be paid by somebody, in this case, government, right, and fiscal resources.
Angela from the Bangkok Post. In ASEAN country, I mean Asian country, country in Asia that they spend a lot of money on general fuel subsidies, like you mentioned India and Indonesia. Is that just for my general knowledge? Is it because of they have a large population, that's why they have to spend a lot of money on general fuel subsidy, or they have a lot of poor people, or they have varieties of general fuel that they are subsidy right now? So why the reason they spend a lot of money on the general fuel subsidies?
Probably the energy producing country started introducing this general fuel subsidy to compensate or to offset the revenue from the export of the energy to satisfy or raise the standard of living for people. However, the story started changing. Some net exporter of the energy, some net energy exporting countries become net importing countries. If that is the case, they have to change the policy. But since they have been implemented the policy for long, so many citizens in those countries took it for granted. So something that citizens take for granted now start scrapping all those benefits. It faces a huge resistance. For non-energy exporting countries, they didn't have a specific reason to introduce fuel subsidies, but some countries they did, in order to protect the poor people from the fluctuation of the energy price. So I think that is the sort of the initiation of the general fuel subsidies. Now, as I mentioned, Indonesia case, now they become a net importer. So what's the point of say, maintaining these general fuel subsidies? And on top of that, the general fuel subsidies do not benefit the poor people. They sometimes waste money to encourage the overconsumption, middle income, and the rich people, because the poor people have no cars to drive. What's the point of reducing the gas price for the poor people? No point.
If I may just briefly add to that, fuel subsidies, they arise, right, at the beginning because they're politically popular and they're easy to justify. Fuel is a basic necessity. The poor need fuel, so politicians, right, especially populist politicians, introduce fuel subsidies, justifying it, saying, oh, this is good for the poor. We need this to help the poor. But in fact, of course, it ends up being captured mostly by middle class and rich people, the people who vote. So once it's introduced, it's politically very difficult to remove. That's why there's so much political resistance. So it's like like so many subsidies, not just fuel subsidies, but subsidies in general. Once they're introduced, because they create special interest groups, right, that benefit from them. But in this case, it's a very large part of the population, middle class and rich people, rich voters. So it becomes very, very difficult to remove.
I have two more questions. But first, since we're here to exchange information, I thought we might comment as well. We informed you that Thailand's electricity price is not very high because we have legacy gas, which is half the price of the imported gas, and it contributes to about 85% of our electricity generation. I have two questions. One is, you mentioned a lot about alternative energy. I just read in The Economist, the latest version, the title was Sunny, Windy, and Very Costly. So how far can you push this alternative energy? Eventually it translates into very high cost, and Germany is a lot of people quote Germany as the model to go when it comes to alternative energy, but it's also extremely very expensive. So I'd like to ask, and this linking to your analysis is that, does this analysis also take into consideration of the changing global energy mix in the global economy? What are the Western countries moving towards? What is, if you look at the policies of big countries, like Germany and France, which way are they heading? And how would that affect the supply side of the global energy? And the second question is about fuel subsidy. Have you taken into consideration, when you project the demand of energy demand, have you taken into consideration of this subsidies? I think a lot of Asian countries now are facing fiscal constraints because of the very bad economic environment, and they now have to be squeezed into eliminating these fuel subsidies. Thailand is a case, Indonesia is a case, Malaysia is a case. So this will certainly change the trend in energy demand quite significantly when price reflect cost or even to go up to global prices. Whether your projection of our very high demand already taken into the correction that would happen in case the subsidies are eliminated.
Let me take the first question before I give the second question to Dr. Lee. I mean, again, renewable energy, right? You can be skeptical about renewable energy, right? And what's the title again? Sunny, windy, and very costly. But I mean, it's not cost competitive now, but as one of the slides shows, costs are already coming down significantly, although it will still take more than 10, 15, 20 years, right? But that, I think the fact that renewable energy is not cost competitive, that rational private sector companies will not therefore invest, right? I think that strengthens the case, especially in the rich countries, for governments to take the lead in investing in nuclear energy, because to take a longer time horizon, because I mean just as a matter of common sense, in the end, coal, oil, no matter how LNG, no matter how cheap they are in the short run, of course in the long run, they are not renewable, right? I mean sooner or later, and they are exhaustible, right? They will be depleted. So if we just wait until the end, that would just be catastrophic, especially since nuclear energy has very substantial environmental benefits, which again the private sector does not take into account. So longer time horizon, number one. Environmental benefits, number two. For these reasons, governments, right, especially governments in more advanced countries, they really should take the lead in developing or investing in nuclear energy so that their costs do come down. So we have, what is it, windy, sunny, and not so costly. I think that should really be what we should be looking forward to.
Just on top of Dr. Park's reply, for Sri Lanka's case, the major supply source of energy has been biomass. But the share started declining substantially over the next 10, 20 years. So now they face a really difficult situation, what to replace the biomass, especially the biomass from the lumber. So they think about, I think the policymakers at this point, they start increasing the coal fire power plant, which is a bad idea, I think. The other way is the wind. Chinese suppliers of the wind equipment, they already estimate how much it costs for them to replace the total amount of the energy source by biomass, by wind, and it becomes very cost competitive. So for some countries, wind and solar can be the major source of the energy to meet the primary energy demand. So we cannot generalize for developing Asia as a whole. The subsidy, when we try to make a projection on this, one study simultaneously have conducted with the efficiency, the demand management efficiency rate. So how much for specific countries, for big countries like China, India, and other countries, if they manage well in the demand side energy efficiency level, how much energy they can save. Thailand case is over 20 years they try to save 20% or 25% from the demand management. For China's case, from the country level case, we have 15 to 20% of energy conserving from the demand management side. When it comes to the energy efficiency demand side, it's not really straightforward. Nothing is straightforward, as a matter of fact, because we have a layer of the delivery the electricity, say the plant area. What is the efficiency management they can apply? Now it transmits to wholesale. What is the energy efficiencies, the AC, DC, how much the electricity delivery line they have to, which way, and then so on. And then it goes to the retail distribution, and how much energy we can save by the energy demand, energy efficiency technology. Now it comes to the consumer. Now it has a totally different picture. So consumers like us, when we start building, how do we build an energy efficiency building to conserve the energy? Say, what's the window thickness, and what is the, all those things, and other measures will play a complicated role in two sides. So by looking at so many different layers in terms of the energy management, efficiency management, we came up with this, the China, and we have as Dr. Park described, we have a separate two-country case at the end of the book. Most of the projections, we use top-bottom approach, which is easier. Just look at the macro value and make a projection. But for China, India case, we use the bottom to top approach, which is very difficult and time-consuming. That's why we were able to come up with the exact numbers in terms of energy efficient way of saving energy, and how much and at which level how much we can save in those two countries. So yes, we do incorporate the energy efficiency measure.
So in other words, what Dr. Lee is saying is we do allow for the removal of energy subsidies too. Yeah, because that directly relates to improving energy efficiency.